Anyway, as the war went on, more and more American troops went over there, got involved in drugs, the drug trade. Took out a whole lot of troops. And my sergeants, when I was in the Army, would tell me, when I joined the Army in 1980, that they'd wake up in the morning and find the guard whom they was expecting to protect him was found he had this knife from ear to ear. Yes? Is that test what? Oh, do you mean test 4? Okay. I can find that in an instant for you. Okay. Okay, just put down. Now you can put the answer. Okay, you got to stand on. Make sure you put down red, so I'll know which one. Okay. All right. The Vietnam War divided the country as no other war we've had ever has. In World War I, the country was united. We got defeated Germany. World War II, the country was united. Korea, somewhat less so. In Vietnam, people did not want to fight, and I've told you how the college students would rebel and riot. A lot of young men burned their draft cards, went to Sweden, went to Canada. Eventually, later presidents allowed them to return. President Nixon would not, but they went to any place they could, any way they could to escape the draft. A lot of persons went to college. Mostly only men served, and a few women who did serve were mostly nurses. More and more, the South Vietnamese wanted Americans to go home. They felt like if Americans went home, they could solve their own problems. The most famous man who refused to serve was the boxing champ Muhammad Ali. And eventually, the Supreme Court sided with him and ruled in his favor that he had a right to become a conscientious objector, owing to the fact that he was now he was an official in the Muslim movement. Now, the Vietnam War was the first war that we could watch on television, but we were not being told the truth. This became especially true during the My Lai massacre, when a man named Lieutenant Calley massacred a whole village, 50 people, mostly old women and old men and children, none of whom were communists, just went in and massacred them. And this was covered up for about a year. But a bunch of persons began to wonder about this, and a particular reporter went in determined to uncover the truth. He uncovered the whole bad story about the My Lai massacre. And it was a big scandal. Lieutenant Calley was eventually put on trial for murder. A lot of persons sympathized with him, and eventually Lieutenant Calley was released, but the trial lasted for years and years. Released on the grounds that those men over there could not tell friend from foe. The men over there could not tell who was who and what was what. And the only man you could guess was your buddy, was the man standing beside you. Otherwise, any Vietnamese you saw might be communist. You could not tell who was who and what was what. And under the circumstances, inevitably some kind of massacres like this were going to occur. Now, you might not agree with it, folk. I mean, it's hard to make up your mind, know what do you do? But eventually, a lot of sympathy poured in for Lieutenant Calley. And he was somewhat exonerated. Now, again, Lyndon Johnson finally announced that he would not run for president. The Paris peace negotiations began. The Paris peace negotiations lasted for 5 years. Eventually, Henry Kissinger was able to work up a peace. Now, folk, I want to say again, Henry Kissinger's peace treaties wound up being worth only about 2 or 3 years of peace, and worth nothing more than that. Now, to make a long story short, when the peace treaty was signed, after Nixon got in office, the long war ended in January 1973. This was at the height of Nixon's popularity. I mean, Nixon, he had won a big election, losing only the state of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. So he'd only lost about 8 or 10 electoral votes, I mean, won by a big margin. Then the troops came, a lot of POWs released. Now, when I say the POWs released, there's still the MIAs, missing in actions, and they're still unaccounted for. Now, I heard a story just 2 or 3 weeks ago that a Vietnamese war veteran had just been found, still alive. He'd been roaming the jungles all this time, but somehow that never made much news. I don't know why. There are rumors that a lot of these soldiers were enslaved, or whatever happened to them, we don't know, but the MIAs are mostly unaccounted for to this day. Anyway, some of our POWs were released and they came home, and most of them who were married quickly got divorced. They found out their wives had learned how to be independent of them, were no longer the meek, self-subservient women they had been. A lot of them quickly divorced. Things were not great for the men who came home. Nixon had barely won the election in 1968. And you might wonder, hey, well, the reason a lot of people did not like Nixon. Nixon had shown a lot of childlike qualities from the very beginning, and I used to say, I wish that boy would grow up. I wish that boy would grow up more than once. The two men were at odds with each other. Even though it's true Eisenhower's grandson married Nixon's daughter, that did not really help relations. The fact is, Nixon had some problems that were eventually to drive him out of the White House. Nixon sought détente with the Soviet Union. That is a word that I learned, when I was just out of college. Détente, that we're going to try to be friends with them, have something, a working relationship, overlook our ideological differences. And the SALT Treaty was set up, SALT, Strategic Arms. That was another attempt at disarmament. SALT, SALT Treaty. That's both sides, let's disarm ourselves. Well, in the meantime, in Chile, far down south in Latin America, the nation of Chile voted a communist in office named Salvador Allende. This was the first time a communist had been voted into office by means of a popular election. Or one of the first. In Guatemala they'd done that, and the United States had ousted him. And then the Dominican Republic had done that. But Chile this man was actually openly out and out communist, democratically elected. The United States went in to try to undermine him. Within 4 years, Allende was killed. What role the United States played in the killing of him is still unclear. I did some research on that one time. You can't really put your finger on and say he actually did, but your book says that Nixon helped to overthrow Allende in Chile. He probably did. So what happened? A very, very brutal man took his place. Folk, the Cubans got rid of Batista, and they got Castro. In 1917, the Russians got rid of the last Tsar, and they got Lenin and Stalin. Do you get what I'm saying? You get rid of a bad guy and you replace him with a worse. It's in there, yes.
Yeah, what I found to be interesting, the Cuban people that I met, they loved this guy. They loved
Cuba, Castro?
Castro, they loved him.
Yeah.
They
Well, but he executed a lot of them, put a lot of them in prison. Right?
Yeah.
But, okay, I'll tell you why. It's the same thing that the people of Iran liked Saddam Hussein, and the people of Russia, a lot of them got out to where they liked Stalin.
Saddam Hussein was Iraq, I believe, not Iran.
What's that?
Saddam Hussein.
Oh, okay,
was-
thank you.
yeah.
the people of Iraq, like Saddam, thank you, I'll stand corrected. He enforced the rules. Now, here is a point I'm going to make right now. I was going to save it later. Democracy does not work for a lot of the world's people. And I read a book one time where the United States has been guilty of spreading the poison of democracy among people who cannot handle it. When Saddam Hussein was ousted from Iraq, the situation in Iraq got really, really bad. Gaddafi was a dictator. The United States helped oust Gaddafi, and guess what? The situation in Libya has gone from bad to worse. We helped oust Salvador Allende in Chile, and a dictator, very bad dictator, took over. What am I saying? For some people, the only thing that works is an autocratic government where that one man is in charge. Everybody knows that man. That man says what he wants, and what he says goes. Anything else is chaos. I mean, in Singapore, things got so bad that finally a dictator took over, and he began to imprison a bunch of them and cane a bunch of others, and whoops, all of a sudden there's law and order in Singapore. Whatever you can say about these men, whether it be Hussein or Stalin or Gaddafi, they kept order. They kept law and order in their country. The bad guys were punished. The good guys had nothing to fear from them. If you kept these men's laws, fine. Of course, you were not allowed freedom to dissent, but if you kept the law, you were okay. The bad guys, they got it and they deserved it, most of them. So the people liked him. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of a side. You don't have to Soviet Union. Right after the communists took over Russia in 1917, Lenin passed a law that everything, all sexual activity was to be free and open. No restraints. Forget traditional Christian morality. We weren't Christian anymore. Well, the result was their children became incorrigible, their men became irresponsible deadbeat dads, and their women became psychotic, nervous wrecks. I could have used another word, but basically, their women became bipolar. Well, along came Stalin. Lenin lasted 5 years. Stalin, he said, we're not going to allow this. He outlawed adultery. He said that deadbeat dads had to pay up or go to jail, and the people of Russia loved it. And basically he outlawed fornication, outlawed any other sex other than between a man and wife. And that way every child knew who his father was, every child knew his mother was. The children became lined up and walked the straight and narrow. Crime went down. Again, that's why these men can be popular, even though they do wind up executing a whole lot of folk. But they're liked by the people. Because, again, when you get rid of them, things go from bad to worse.
Because I think from what I understood and what I heard about the Cuban thing, was that he didn't believe, he wanted to like take all, like, what people believe, take all the money from the haves and redistribute it, and
I will tell you something, that's a really, all right, I don't know if you're here, but I talk about the papers. A lot of the people in my two classes believe that.
Yeah, so that's what I said, when you know the backdrop, like with him, that was his goal. Then it really, his partner who he ran with Che Guevara.
Che Guevara.
Yeah, Guevara. He believed that, but then he thought, okay, their goal was to go and conquer the world. So Castro wanted to stay there. So if you notice, they separated because he was thinking, Che was like, look, I'll go start all over and continue the mission. Well, it wasn't just stay in Cuba. It was like get the world.
Yeah.
You see, man, he wasn't about that. He got what he really wanted. He used Che as his enforcer to get that stuff. But Che kept wanting, let's finish the mission.
Well, the reason Castro survived was he got one country and stayed.
Right.
The reason Hitler, quickly he conquered France, conquered Belgium, conquered the Netherlands, conquers Norway, he spread himself too thin. Conquered Denmark, but he spread himself too thin. And Japan did the same thing. I mean, they've tried to fight a war with China, with India, the United States, and Great Britain. Couldn't do it.
And seeing Castro wanted that, he said, okay, we got one, let's regroup, let's go. Che was younger, well, look, man, look, let's keep going. Like
He wound up getting himself
Yeah,
killed.
get himself killed, you know.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Now, Nixon supported the Shah of Iran, and folk, that turned out to be a bad move later. The Shah of Iran was a very, very brutal dictator. In 1967, Israel fought its Six-Day War. It was a stunning victory for Israel. In 6 days, Israel blew off the field the armies of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. There was, and again, these countries, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, got its weapons from Russia, the Soviet Union. Israel got its weapons from the United States. When the weapons were tested in real combat, the Israelis just like they huffed and puffed and blew the Arabs off the battlefield. And I was getting out of high school at the time, June 1973. Or June 1967, June 1967, yes.
I have a question in reference to the Shah. I don't know how true this is, but it was always said when I was growing up and I was taught this, that you remember the oil crisis that we supposedly had, the gas,
Yeah.
I said the Shah was willing, he had the ships, the oil ready to be imported, but our government had them held out in the sea so that they could raise the gas prices and so-called create so that was the theory, you know.
Something like that might have happened. Regrettably, I don't know the
Yeah,
details.
so me neither, that's why I was just going maybe.
Essentially now, the Shah turned out to be a really brutal dictator
Right.
whom the people of Iran wanted to get rid of. He tortured his people. So they got rid of him and got Ayatollah Khomeini.
But they were saying it was quoted because they said the Shah himself said, what kind of nation will look here, got the oil, give it to them, and now they're holding their Shah.
This was said during the oil embargo crisis of 1973. Reasoner and Smith, two reporters for, I believe, CB, one of those big networks, would say, we know that the tankers are sitting there in the ocean.
Right.
I mean, if you've seen an oil tanker, it is huge.
Yes.
I mean, they are really, really huge. I saw one time. I could not believe the size of that thing. I mean, these oil tankers. But they were sitting there anchored some miles offshore. This was widely rumored, even during the time of the crisis. And again, folk, did he want to get prices raised? There is, because what happened, the price of gasoline went from 28 cents a gallon to 34 cents per gallon, then to 55 cents per gallon, then to 65. Oh, they thought it was high. So, but if you can pay 65 cents per gallon, I'm thinking it's high. Then it went to $1 a gallon, then $1.25 a gallon, then $1.50. It's now this morning, last night I paid about $2.65 a gallon.
Yeah.
And we think that's cheap because it has been up to $4 a gallon.
Yeah.
There's something like that might have happened.
Yes,
Again, depending on who you listen to.
Right,
and who
that's
you
what I'm
read.
saying, that's what I'm asking.
It's hard to know what to believe. All right. Well, as soon as we got out of Vietnam in January 1973, the North Vietnamese began harassing South Vietnam, and the United States was not help anymore. And to make a long story short, in 1975, North Vietnam launched an all-out invasion, and what was left of the United States and South Vietnam fled. Just simply got out of there and fled as fast as they could get out. And that was basically the end of the Vietnam War, end of defeat. By this time, Ford was president. Now, in the meantime, what was Nixon doing? Well, like I say, Nixon was the height of his power. Everything was going great for him. But an event had occurred that was not paid much attention to at first. Early in June 1972, when Nixon was about to run for president, it was obvious that McGovern would be the champ. McGovern set up his headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. I've seen Watergate. I mean, Watergate Hotel is not just on the edge of Washington, but it eventually the bus tours all included it in their tours because it became, in fact, Watergate became so popular for many, many years afterward. Every presidential scandal was referred to as Gate. Yeah, this gate and that gate, Iran Gate, Contra Gate, Debate Gate. And then under Clinton, you had a lot of them. Monica Gate, Paula Gate, Jennifer Gate, Linda Gate, Fornegate, just one gate after another under Clinton. I mean, I had a friend of mine say, if he's elected, there'll be a scandal every week. There just about was one. But anyway, in the Nixon's case, in June 1972, a security guard, a black security guard who was never able to find work after that and had trouble finding work anyway. I mean, he was working at Watergate Hotel as a security guard, and he noticed some tape on the door of the Democratic headquarters, so he pulled the tape off, like he was supposed to. He thought, some janitors did this, cleaning personnel did this, and they shouldn't have. Well, he came back. I mean, security guards are supposed to never take the same route. They're supposed to keep a different route. Well, he came back to that room several hours later and thought, hey, there was tape on that lock. He said, I knew I pulled it off. Well, he did what he was supposed to do and call the police. Well, the police were really busy that night, and all they could send out were 2 plainclothes detectives in an unmarked car. And I see there was a lookout that if they saw a cop, they would all get out of there quickly. Well, they saw 2 men, and in those days, everybody in Washington wore business suits. These were 2 men in business suits, and nobody thought they were policemen. And they came to the room, and sure enough, there was tape. Now, later on, Gordon Liddy was to say the dumbest thing ever was put the tape back. See, Gordon Liddy was working inside, and he knew the tape had been removed from the door. Well, he just took another piece of tape and put on the lock. Somebody asked me once, what did the tape do? The tape defeated the lock and kept the lock from working. Anyway, he put the tape back on the door. The 2 detectives saw the tape, so they swung the door back open, drew out their service revolvers, and said, come out from behind that with your hands up. There were some men working. They expected 2 hands to come up, and they expected a masked burglar to come up. Instead, 10 hands went up, and the men who owned the hands were wearing business suits. And it turned out they were setting up microphones and wiretaps, all listening devices, trying to listen in on all of the Democratic phone conversations. They weren't stealing anything. Well, they took these men, including Gordon Liddy and McCord and some of the others, to the jail. And the security guards who expected to get off, at 7 o'clock and we'll go home, where they were kept there all day the next day and far into the next night. One of them had a birthday party to attend for his daughter, told, you can't go home, this is too big a case. They knew they had something big, but the country did not pay much attention. McGovern accused the Nixon administration of being the most corrupt in history. Everybody laughed at him. But eventually this was to bring down President Nixon. All right, this happened in June. By January, these men finally came to trial, and the judge's name was Judge Sirica. Judge Sirica said he believed he was more involved in these 5 men. The 5 men tried to confine it to just themselves and said, we acted alone, nobody higher up told us what to do. All right, I'm going to make a long story short here. When you first heard about this, the first thing you thought of was Nixon himself did it. To this day, we have not actually proven that Nixon ever ordered the break-in or knew about it. But he set up the conditions to where such a thing could occur, and what they got him for was cover-up, obstruction of justice. I have often wondered if Nixon and Haldeman, who is Nixon's chief of staff, and Ehrlichman and Dean, if they all didn't cover up for a crime that they didn't even commit. But what happened was, in the morning, Nixon, who lived in the White House, of course, woke up, and these men always turned their radio on first thing, and they all said that's when they first learned about the break-in. Nixon, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, Mitchell. They turned their radios on as they started getting ready, and I can imagine them all shaving while they listened to the radio. And they first learned the break-in, and I imagine Haldeman probably thought, now this is my, I bet Nixon did this. And Nixon probably thought, I wonder if Haldeman didn't do this. And Haldeman was sort of wondering, maybe it was Ehrlichman. But anyway, they all probably knew nothing about it. But they all covered up in a pile, and they all went down in a pile. Now, again, we've never been to prove that Haldeman knew anything about the break-in before you. Nobody's proven Ehrlichman knew. Nobody's proven Dean is still alive. Dean still comments. I mean, he thinks Donald Trump's a louse, and he said so just yesterday. But Dean is in his 80s now. But Dean thinks, I mean, he'll tell you, he didn't know anything about it. But Dean covered up like the rest of them. Now, here's a story that John Dean told in his book, Blind Ambition. He wrote a book. He said that he was assigned to work in the White House, part of the White House staff. Oh, he thought it was great. Well, first thing he was assigned to do was do something illegal. I won't go into detail, but it was do something that was illegal. He just said, I couldn't do it. Into the room walked Gordon Liddy, and welcomed him in, and Dean said, listen, this thing, Nixon's asking, I don't think I can do it. I can't do it. And Liddy said, well, just do it. I can't do this. They said, hey, give it to me, I'll do it. So Dean handed Liddy the paperwork, thinking it was over with, except the next day, back came Liddy with the paperwork and said, okay, Liddy had done an illegal deed overnight. He said, now look, I put your signature down. All you got to do is sign this and give it to Bob Haldeman, and nobody but us knows that I did it. Dean was somewhat, but anyway, Dean finally looked at it, gritted his teeth, signed the paperwork, went to Haldeman's office. Haldeman wasn't there, so he threw it down on Haldeman's desk and walked away. Well, a short time later, over the intercom came Nixon's voice summoning Dean to the Oval Office. And when Dean got to the Oval Office, there was Nixon holding the paperwork, and Haldeman was there, and both men were just beaming. Well, Dean got a little bit more floor space, another secretary or two. Dean got some more illegal work to do, and he farmed that one out, but it has time when he got a little bit more involved in it, and a little bit more after a while he was doing illegal deeds right and left, and hardly even thinking about it. I mean, it's a step-by-step process. The thing that when I was young, my preachers used to warn me, it starts out small, and then grows and grows and grows, and after a while it's taken over, and it's out of control. But anyway, basically, this is what happened to him. And he said he was doing illegal deeds right and left, and when the cover-up came for Watergate, he, Dean, who knew nothing about the break-in until he learned about it on the radio, covered up, think he was covering up for Nixon, or maybe covering up for Haldeman, maybe covering up for Ehrlichman, or maybe covering up for Mitchell, covering up for somebody. He didn't know whom. Didn't know who. Well, make a long story short now, all these men went down in a pile. But the difference was they tried to use Dean as a scapegoat. You know, basically, if you know anything about the scapegoats, the Jews would attach, they'd lay all the blame for all their sins on a goat, and then they'd banish this goat from the camp. You might say, well, why didn't they take the blame themselves? Because simply none of us are able to bear the blame for our own sins. So you have to lay the blame on something else. So they lay the blame on this goat. Well, they tried to use Dean as a scapegoat, lay all the blame for all the wrongs that have been done on Dean and kick Dean out. Dean refused to be a scapegoat, so Dean spent 3 days reading in a monotone voice all the stuff that he had heard about Nixon, had seen about Nixon, and all the stuff that had gone away with the Nixon White House about cover-up. Eventually we learned that Nixon had taped White House conversations. The Supreme Court eventually told Nixon he had to release the tapes. Nixon did. And the tapes told that Nixon had been involved in the cover-up from day 3. Now again, all the tapes that have been released never did show that Nixon ever ordered the break-in or knew about it until he learned about it when it got on the news the following day. But it was cover-up. Cover-up did him in. Nixon fought it, and for many months all we heard was Watergate, Watergate. I mean, the Vietnam War was over, so we heard Watergate, 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 Watergate. Nixon was unable to act as president. He tried hard to, put Watergate behind. He couldn't put Watergate behind him. Eventually, Nixon saw that he had only about 15 votes in the Senate, and he could not stand an impeachment trial, so he resigned. Now, the impeachment thing is up, and I could guarantee you, if the House were to vote for impeachment, our present president might be impeached in the House, but he would never get removed in the Senate. Probably not. But in Nixon's case, as long as he had 34 senators who he thought would vote with him, he could stay in office. But eventually Barry Goldwater came to see him, who'd run for president in '64, and said, you don't have the support, Nixon. You just don't have the support in the Senate. that only about 14, 15 senators would have voted against impeachment. He was certain to have been removed from office. Nixon resigned, becoming the only president to do so. While this was going on, North Vietnam was engaging in the campaign against South Vietnam, and Nixon could do nothing about it.